Today we have a crazy revenge story about an uncle who tried to ruin the family. We'll get into in a bit, but first, my landlord didn't know he had met his match till it was too late. My name is Christopher, and this is my revenge story against my landlord. She was moving mad, and I had to show her I could be crazier. Moving to this small town was supposed to be a fresh start for me, a chance to leave behind the chaotic life of the city. Before this, I spent nearly 2 decades working in security, specifically in tenant-landlord disputes. I've seen everything from landlords exploiting loopholes to tenants trying to game the system. It gave me a unique perspective, one where I understood the law inside and out. I knew every trick in the book, and I'd witnessed enough classes to know that knowledge truly is power when push comes to shove. So when I found this modest apartment in a small town, it seemed perfect. The city itself was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows your name. My apartment wasn't anything fancy, a 2-bedroom unit in an old building with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was enough for me and my roommates. The tranquility of this town was a welcome change, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally relax. The landlord, Mr. James, seemed like a decent guy, hands-off but fair. Things were good, at least in the beginning. Mr. James was one of those landlords you barely noticed, which was just how I liked it. We had a simple arrangement. The rent was due on the 1st, but because of my roommates' varying pay schedules, I usually paid it a day or two late. Mr. James didn't seem to mind as long as the rent was in by the 3rd. It was a comfortable setup, and for the first year, it worked perfectly. We kept the place tidy, didn't make a lot of noise, and generally stayed off his radar. My roommates and I got along well enough. We weren't best friends, but we made it work. There was Kayla, a night nurse who was hardly ever home, and Henry, a college student who kept to himself most of the time. I don't really want to get into how we all met ourselves, as that would be a story for another day. However, I was the most organized of the bunch, so I took the responsibility of managing the rent payments. It wasn't a big deal. I had experience dealing with landlords and leases, so it made sense for me to handle it. We had a good system going, or so I thought. One morning, out of the blue, I received a curt email informing me that our property was now under new management. The tone was different from Mr. James's casual approach. This was all business. The new property manager, Miss Harper, wasted no time laying down the law. Rent was now due on the 1st of every month with no exceptions. Any late payments would incur immediate penalties. It was a sharp shift from the easygoing arrangement we'd grown accustomed to, and it immediately set my nerves on edge. I knew this was going to be trouble. As expected, my roommates didn't take the news well. Kayla, with her unpredictable shifts, struggled to make the new deadline, while Henry's student loan disbursements often came a few days late. The result? Late fees. And since I was the one in charge of the rent, those extra fees fell squarely on my shoulders. I tried to keep the peace, covering the extra costs and reassuring them that we'd figure it out. But the tension between us and the management company was getting worse. I could feel the walls closing in, and it wasn't long before things started to unravel. Not long after Miss Harper took over, the apartment started showing signs of wear and tear. At first, it was just little things, a leaky faucet here, a flickering light there. I reported these issues, expecting the usual prompt repairs, but days turned into weeks and nothing happened. It was as if our requests were being tossed into a black hole. I began to sense a pattern, one that I didn't like. The more I asked for help, the more the problems piled up, and the more the landlord seemed to vanish into thin air. Then the big problems started. The water heater went out one morning, leaving us with nothing but cold showers. I reported it immediately, but the response was silence. A few weeks later, the refrigerator stopped working. I was livid. We lost a week's worth of groceries, and when I called to demand a repair, I was met with vague promises that someone would come by next week. Next week came and went, and still nothing. The apartment was falling apart around us, and the management didn't seem to care. Each day, my frustration grew more and more, turning what was once a peaceful living into a daily source of stress. I wasn't about to let this slide. Every time something broke, I documented it. I kept detailed logs of every email, every phone call, and every unanswered maintenance request. I even started taking pictures of the problems: the broken heater, the defrosting freezer, the mold creeping into the bathroom corners. I sent these to Miss Harper, hoping that sheer volume might force some action, but nothing changed. The landlord's obligations were clear: but they were completely ignoring them. It was as if they didn't think I'd fight back, but I knew better. With every ignored request, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just negligence, it was abuse, and I was done being their victim. It widened the gap and strain I had already previously felt with my housemates, too. It was as though they expected me to bear the cost of all the repairs, and there was no way I could do that with the payments of the additional cost and all. They kept badgering me to do something about it, and I kept giving them the vague responses that I had sent repeated messages, but no one was responding. It all came to a head one night when Kayla finally snapped. "I can't do this anymore, Alex," she said. Frustration etched across her face. Henry nodded in agreement, already packing his bags. The constant cold showers, the spoiled food, and the landlord's silence had pushed them over the edge. Within a week, they were gone, leaving me alone in an apartment that was quickly becoming uninhabitable. The full burden of the rent and the fight ahead now rested solely on my shoulders. Sitting alone in the crumbling apartment, surrounded by reminders of what it had become, I realized I had two choices: accept defeat or fight back. This wasn't just about me anymore. I knew the system inside and out, and I knew exactly how to use it to my advantage. This landlord had underestimated me, and that was their first mistake. I was done playing nice. It was time to make them pay for every single infraction. With renewed determination, I began to prepare. I'd already started documenting everything, but now I doubled down. Every maintenance failure, every unauthorized entry, every ridiculous late fee. I recorded it all. Photos, detailed logs, and copies of every ignored request were meticulously organized. I knew that in a tribunal, evidence was king, and I was building an unassailable case. The neglect was systemic, and I was going to prove it. The final piece of my plan was the hardest but necessary. I stopped paying rent. I knew it would trigger a reaction, but that's what I wanted. The tribunal summons would come, and when it did, I'd be ready. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to turn the tables. It wasn't just about getting out of rent. This was about making the landlord pay for every single incompetence they had shown. The summons arrived just as I knew it would. A crisp envelope with the tribunal seal stamped on the front. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of what was to come. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for. My apartment had become a war room, every surface covered in meticulously organized evidence. I reviewed everything one last time, ensuring every document, every photograph was in order. I wasn't just ready, I was over-prepared. Walking into the tribunal felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The room was stark, with harsh lighting that made everyone's expression sharper, more intense. The landlord, Mr. James, sat across from me, flanked by his lawyer, both wearing smug, confident smiles. They clearly expected a quick win. The adjudicator entered, and the room fell silent. I could feel the tension in the air as everyone settled in, unaware that they were about to witness a very different outcome. When it was my turn, I stood, exuding calm confidence. I began by laying out the facts, clear, precise, and irrefutable. The tribunal was not a place for emotional outbursts or vague accusations. It was a place for cold, hard evidence. I presented photos of the disrepair, logs of every ignored request, and copies of every fee I had unjustly paid. With each piece of evidence, I could see the landlord and his lawyer's confidence wane, their smiles fading into disbelief. When the landlord's lawyer finally spoke, their argument was weak, centered around my late rent payments, a point that only served to highlight their pettiness in the face of my overwhelming evidence. He tried to justify the neglect, but the adjudicator's patience was visibly wearing thin. I watched as the adjudicator's frustration grew, his gaze shifting from the landlord's feeble defense to the undeniable proof of the landlord's failures. The case was falling apart before their eyes, and they knew it. The ruling came swiftly, the adjudicator's voice firm. The tenant has provided substantial evidence of the landlord's failure to maintain the property and unlawful behavior, he began. My heart raced as he continued. I'm awarding 9 months of rent-free living to the tenant and ordering all repairs to be completed within the next month. The words hit the landlord like a sledgehammer. Her face turned crimson, the smugness replaced by a mix of shock and humiliation. She tried to protest, but the adjudicator cut her off, finalizing the verdict with a tone that brooked no argument. When I left the tribunal, I felt a relief wash over me. It wasn't just a win, it was justice. The landlord had been taken down, not by brute force, but by the very system she had tried to manipulate. I had fought back, and I had won. I planned to stay the full 9 months, living rent-free while the landlord scrambled to make the mandated repairs. The victory was sweet, but it was more than that. It was a reminder that sometimes the little guy can win, and win big. I had already planned that I would leave at the end of the 9 months. I gave my notice, knowing full well that the landlord had no grounds to enforce the usual 3-month notice period due to their negligence. The apartment was now eerily quiet as I packed up my things. I walked through each room one last time, reflecting on the struggle, the victories, and the ultimate sense of satisfaction that came with it. Leaving felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a victory over not just the landlord, but over the system's abuse. It was too bad that my housemates didn't wait to see the end of the battle. I entered the fight knowing I would likely win. It wasn't a fight that I was at fault. That's why the revenge made so much sense. Watching the landlord appear before the tribunal and even having to come to the apartment to have a mandatory inspection on all the things I laid out during the procession made all the sufferings all the more worthwhile. Perhaps she'll check properly next time to see that the next tenant was someone that could be overridden. As for me, she finally met her match. Woohoo! All right, Christopher. I don't know if that's a throwaway name or not, but way to fight the good fight. Stick it to the man. You did your due diligence. You prepared this perfectly. You were absolutely ready to go to this tribunal. I mean, it sounds so dramatic, right? Like I'm going to the tribunal to take down the evil landlord. And you did it. Good on you. Beautiful story. Also, hi, my name is Brendan, and if you guys enjoy these Nuclear Revenge videos, it would be awesome if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to our podcast. That said, our next story is my experience in a toxic marriage. My first marriage was a toxic marriage. It didn't last long. I got married in September 2021, and a year and a half later, my wife and I had gotten divorced. We had a spontaneous relationship which moved too fast while we were dating, and this affected our marriage greatly. We both had our share of blames. Mine would be not getting to know my wife enough before proposing we got married, and she was too self-centered and inconsiderate to my needs. I got married to my wife 7 months after we met. It was one of those decisions we made on a whim, out of emotions. I know she came from a prestigious home and had a close relationship with her family, but that was about it. I was too love-blinded to have noticed some things I should have known before getting married, and that cost me greatly. We had one of those quick registry marriages, and my wife seemed content with it. We then proceeded to have a discussion about houses and where to live. My wife wanted to have a house with her own backyard and space. She was a lover of nature and likes to groom plants and flowers to her taste, so we decided to opt for a house with a large space and in a state like Houston that wasn't really hard to find, but my wife had specific taste and was on a mission to find her dream house. There was a lot of factors we had to consider while making this decision. Like, for starters, I had to consider my line of work. I was a vet doctor planning on opening his own veterinary center, so I was leaning more towards Midtown, but my wife preferred Houston Heights. I had some savings from my last job, and my wife was from a rich home, so money wasn't really a problem. She wanted her dream house, and she was willing to loan me a certain amount of money for the house, which I could pay back when I got my center open and business was booming. It wasn't an easy decision to make because I knew what my responsibility was, and I didn't want to look like a gold digger to her parents, who weren't really a fan of me, but the other part of me chose to ignore that because my wife actually did not mind. She knew how hard I worked to get to the point I was. Besides, we were married, and that was what marriage was about. Making things work together. I knew it wouldn't be fair to accept a loan from my wife and deny her the right to her dream place, so we settled on moving to the Heights and started working on finding a place. The prices of houses were scary, but whenever I protested, my wife got furious, blaming my poor background on my cheap taste. I was just trying to work on budget. I couldn't go beyond my capacity just to impress my wife, but she always claimed there was more than enough money from her end and she could afford it. We were just starting our journey, and a part of me also wanted to see what it was like living in a luxurious home, so I kept accepting her offer, which kept increasing my debt to her, and before we knew it, we were house hunting. The search for the house took about 4 months because my wife was picky about her taste. After a lot of back and forth, we eventually became house owners, and it was a big relief to get that over with. I wanted to get started on finding a location that best suits my line of work, or at least a nice section of building to rent for my own job. Anything just to get started on so I could know I was onto something. But then my wife comes with allegations that the house interior wasn't to her taste and it needed renovation. I told her I was fine with everything, and if she had a problem with it, it was up to her to make the changes and not my problem. Besides, I had bigger worries. But I had no idea I was married to a child because my wife began demanding I pay her back the money she loaned me since she needed her money to redesign the interior of the house to her taste. Honestly, the state of the house was fine. Everyone I showed the building were always in awe of the place, especially the interior design. They found it appealing and modern, except my wife. I tried to be more considerate to her feelings and explained that we could always work on the interior when I got my own workplace, but she claimed I always put my needs before hers, which was funny because I always factored in her concerns before mine, so hearing her say something like that just made me mad. I know it seemed like I put myself in this position, but she wasn't like that before we got married. I had no idea if she was suppressing this selfish side of hers while we were dating, or if it was always there and I was oblivious to it. But one thing I knew for sure was that we had a deal. I was to return the money to her when I got my veterinary center started and was making money from it, and there was no way in hell I was going to give back the money I didn't have available. She ended up making the interior changes, I'm guessing from her money, and we moved in. It didn't make any difference to me, but my wife said she saw the difference and that was what mattered. My realtor and I had been talking about the best places to start up a business like mine, and on this very day, I got a call from him telling me he found the perfect place for my job. This was in front of my wife, so she wanted to check out the place. I told her it wasn't necessary, but she insisted, saying she had a good eye for these things and it was clear her expertise was needed. We got to the location and, as you can guess, my wife wasn't a fan of it. Sure, the place needed some renovations here and there, but it wasn't so bad, especially because it was an old restaurant looking to be remodeled and the owner was an old man willing to sell out the place. My wife was against the building, while my agent and I thought it was a good investment. But one thing I knew for sure was that I was interested in getting the place. A little while later, we went to see the building. My wife informed me her parents would be coming over to stay for a while. I had no problem with that. They were always welcome, but part of me suspected it was more than a random visit. My father-in-law wasn't a fan of me. I once overheard him telling my wife my job is what dumb idiots who couldn't make it to medical school use to console themselves and pretend to be doctors and doesn't think I make enough to care for his daughter's needs. My wife was well aware of the way her dad sees me, so I had no idea why she would invite them over to our house, but according to her, she had invited them over so they could finally get the chance to see me in person, and it was my chance to prove my worth to them. I wasn't trying to be pessimistic, but a part of me knew nothing good was going to come out of their visit, but I couldn't turn down my in-laws from visiting. They came as intended, and from the moment her dad saw me, I could tell he was disappointed at his daughter's choice in making me her husband. All through the awkward ride home, he kept stealing glances at me, which I was sure was him assessing my outfit and probably how much it cost. He also hated the neighborhood as soon as we arrived. In his opinion, there were too much blacks living in the area, and while that sounded insulting and racist, I was trying to get my father-in-law to like me, so I said nothing. I really tried to be a great host to my in-laws. Took them on a tour around the city, when my wife's mom insisted their room was way colder than the rest of the house, while ours was warmer. I suggested we switch rooms immediately. I tried to warm up to her dad over dinner, but he just wasn't feeling me. I think he hated my guts. Nothing I did mattered or pleased them, and my wife never interfered in our matter. Then suddenly her dad suggested we had a quick meeting. I thought they were going to reprimand my wife and I for not having a large wedding, but I got the most astonishing news of my life. My father-in-law was suggesting I give up the building I wanted to acquire for my job to my wife, who wanted to open a flower shop, while I retake some exam, and if I get lucky and get accepted by law school, I could become a lawyer and help him run his business. This was the only way I could get him to accept me. I was stunned. I had no idea they knew about my plans to open my own center. My wife must have told them about that. But that wasn't as insulting as my wife's parents having no respect for me and thinking they could dictate the course of my life as they saw fit, and I would agree just because I want them to like me. I was so mad at my wife and her parents, I left the house without saying a word. I needed to cool my temper. I took a long drive feeling so betrayed by my wife. I knew it was her idea in the first place, but she needed her fierce dad to back her up because he had a more authoritative tone and he was a lawyer. He knew how to bait someone. I got several calls from my wife, which I ignored, and went back home to tell my wife and in-laws that was never going to happen. Her dad tried to blackmail me by saying he was just trying to be polite and he was more than capable of getting the place for his daughter. He was just trying to be a gentleman, which sounded funny to me, but I wasn't going down so easily. I called my realtor to get me an appointment with the owner of the building, and we set up a meeting the next day where I thoroughly explained my case to him. He was an old man, probably in his 80s if I were to guess. He listened to what I had to say and told me someone was offering him a much better proposal and he would have to meet them too before he could make a decision. I knew that was my father-in-law making his move, but I couldn't stop a businessman from doing business. It was up to the owner of the house to make his decision, and I could only hope it worked in my favor. I knew my marriage was over. There was no coming back from this. My wife and I would not be able to go far with the type of in-laws I had. I called my mom and told her what had happened, and she felt it was best I made the decision on what to do next by myself, while advising me not to give up on that building. I could only handle one thing at a time, so I focused my energy on trying to get the building. By now, my wife and I were staying in separate rooms, so it was easier for me to think clearly. In the end, I got the building thanks to my father-in-law's pompous attitude. He was rude to the owner of the building and made some racist remarks to him regarding his skin color, and that was more than enough for the owner of the house to switch sides. I ended up getting the building, and this caused a huge fight between my wife and I. We got divorced some months later, and I packed out of the house since that was the fair thing to do. I got the house with her money, and it was only fair she gets it. I got to start my veterinary center, and fighting for that building was the best decision because business has been thriving more than ever. So I'm glad to hear that this got a happy ending, but let this be a lesson to the hazards of moving too quickly in a relationship, especially jumping straight to marriage and moving in together when you don't even know that your father-in-law-to-be is a raving lunatic racist. Not saying that that can't be overcome, but when you move so quickly, you're not really giving yourself time to accept these kinds of things. It's all just sort of thrown on you at once. And yeah, there's just no shot that this was ever going to work. Good job splitting from each other, and I'm glad to hear that the business is thriving. Our next story is why I stopped messing with my family. The kind of family I was born into had this weird closeness. I say funny because to the outside world, many might have considered the way we moved strange. We were the kind of family that stuck together, no matter what. My parents, Sarah and David, made sure of that. They were always the glue that held us all together, teaching us the importance of honesty and loyalty. Every evening, we gathered around the dinner table, sharing stories about our day and laughing at jokes that only we understood. There was a warmth in our home that made it feel like the safest place on earth. As the middle child, I had always been the one who noticed things. I wasn't as rebellious as Lucas, my older brother, or as carefree as Chloe, my younger sister. Lucas was 19, a bit of a rebel, but deep down, he had a protective side that only came out when it was really needed. Chloe, at 13, was full of energy and always looked up to me, which was kind of sweet. We were all different, but that was what made us close. And you could be sure that we had each other's backs, right? But there was one person who didn't quite fit into our little world, Uncle Victor. He was my mom's older brother and had been around as long as I could remember. On the surface, he was charming, always knowing just what to say and make everyone like him. He visited often, bringing gifts and compliments that seemed just a bit too polished. Everyone else in the family seemed to trust him without a second thought. I'll be honest, I didn't think anything was off about him for the longest time. He was always the nice uncle you could run to if you wanted to get out of something. But I suddenly started feeling a bit uneasy about him. I couldn't explain why at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Of course, I kept it to myself because it didn't really make sense to think that. Plus, it didn't make sense to cause a disruption to the way our family moved, and I did not think either of my parents would believe me even if I tried. Uncle Victor had a way of charming everyone around him. He always knew the right things to say and how to make people feel special and valued. Whenever he visited, he brought gifts, small tokens that seemed thoughtful on the surface. He would compliment Grandma Evelyn on her cooking, praise Lucas for his accomplishments, and tease Chloe just enough to make her giggle. To everyone else, Uncle Victor was the picture of a perfect, caring uncle. But beneath that charm, there was something more. Uncle Victor's compliments often came with a hint of manipulation. He'd subtly suggest ideas that benefited him, framing them as ways to help the family. He'd offer to take care of financial matters or suggest investments that, in the end, always seemed to put him in a better position. Uncle Victor had a way of making people feel indebted to him. He'd help with problems that didn't really need solving, only to remind them later of what he'd done. To the family, he appeared to be a generous, reliable figure, but I could see that his kindness came with strings attached, strings he would pull when it suited him, always with a hidden motive lurking just beneath the surface. I could not understand how no other person could see what he was up to. One time, we were discussing what to do with Grandma Evelyn's savings. She had a decent amount put away, and the family wanted to make sure it was used wisely. Uncle Victor jumped in with a suggestion before anyone else could speak. He proposed investing the money in a foolproof business venture he knew about. He talked it up like it was the best thing since sliced bread, throwing around phrases like secure return and guaranteed profit. At first, everyone was on board, swept up by his enthusiasm, but something didn't sit right with me. The more he talked, the more it felt like he was selling something, not just offering advice. Then Uncle Victor started influencing Grandma Evelyn's opinion of the rest of the family. He would drop little comments here and there, planting seeds of doubt. I overheard him once subtly suggesting that Lucas wasn't responsible enough to manage part of the family business, or that Chloe was too young to understand real financial matters. He even tried to convince Grandma that Mom and Dad were too busy with work to make the right decisions about her care. It was like he was slowly isolating Grandma Evelyn, making her rely on him more and more. The way he managed to twist things so that the family always seemed to need him was unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that Uncle Victor was playing a long game, one where he would be the only winner. My suspicion about Uncle Victor grew stronger every day, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I started paying closer attention to his actions, watching how he moved through the house and how he spoke to the family. It wasn't easy to stay unnoticed, but I managed to blend into the background, quietly observing. I began by keeping track of his conversations, especially the ones he had in hushed tones with Grandma Evelyn or when he thought no one was around. One afternoon, I overheard him talking to Aunt Margaret. They were in the study, voices low but urgent. Uncle Victor was telling her how to handle the others, making sure they didn't ask too many questions about the family's finances. He even mentioned altering some documents to make things look legitimate. Everything he said, when I pieced it all together, felt and sounded like he wanted to deliberately keep my immediate family in the dark. This made me become determined to find proof of what he was doing. I started searching through his belongings whenever he left the room. It was risky, but I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. One day, I found a folder hidden in his briefcase. Inside were documents showing strange transfers of money, some of which had been siphoned from Grandma Evelyn's accounts. There were also notes in Uncle Victor's handwriting, detailing his plans to shift investments in his favor. Something about all of it pissed me off. The fact that he was not scared to leave them where they could easily be found felt like he was rubbing the crazy act in our faces, knowing that we could not do anything about it. The day I confronted Uncle Victor, I felt a mix of anger and fear bubbling inside me. I didn't want to keep quiet, knowing what he was doing to our family, so I waited until we were alone, and then I laid it all out. Everything I'd seen, everything I'd found. I showed him the documents I'd uncovered on my phone, the notes in his handwriting, and even mentioned the conversation I overheard with Aunt Margaret. But Uncle Victor was slick, or at least he thought he was. He didn't flinch or show any sign of guilt. Instead, he laughed it off, saying I'd misunderstood everything. He claimed the documents were just preliminary ideas that hadn't gone anywhere, and that the conversation with Aunt Margaret was about protecting the family's best interests. He spoke to me in that same sweet, convincing tone he used on everyone else, trying to twist my thoughts, making it seem like I was the one who had it all wrong. But I wasn't falling for it. I could see through his lies and manipulation. His denial only confirmed what I already knew. Uncle Victor was playing us all, and he thought he could do the same to me. But this time, he'd met his match. As he tried to convince me to drop the whole thing, I stayed quiet, letting him think he'd won. Inside, though, I was more certain than ever. I was a manipulator true and through, and I was not ready to let him get away with it. The first step was coming up with a plan, and I knew I had to be smart about it. Uncle Victor was a master at covering his tracks, so I couldn't just accuse him outright without solid proof. I needed to set him up in a way that would force him to reveal his true colors to the entire family. It had to be something he couldn't talk his way out of, something that left no room for doubt. After thinking it over, I realized the perfect opportunity would be at one of our family gatherings. Uncle Victor loved those events. It was where he did most of his sweet talking and manipulating. If I could engineer a situation where he'd trip himself up in front of everyone, there'd be no escape. I started crafting a plan that would push him into a corner, where his lies and schemes would unravel before our eyes. Next, I started planting seeds of doubt among the family, casually mentioning how odd it was that Uncle Victor always seemed to be in the middle of every big decision. I didn't push too hard, just enough to get people thinking. I also made sure to be extra nice to him, playing along as if I'd completely bought into his lies. The idea was to lull him into a false sense of security, so he wouldn't see the trap until it was too late. The day of the family gathering arrived, and I was ready. Everyone was there. Mom, Dad, Grandma Evelyn, Lucas, Chloe, Aunt Margaret, and, of course, Uncle Victor. I watched as he made his rounds, chatting with everyone, charming them like he always did. But this time, I wasn't nervous. I knew what was coming. I waited until the conversation turned to family finances, something Uncle Victor never failed to bring up. He started going on about another opportunity he'd found, and that's when I struck. I casually mentioned that I'd found some old documents of his and asked if he could explain them to the family. I pulled out the forged papers, handing them to him in front of everyone. He glanced at them, and for the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, he smiled and started talking, trying to dismiss the documents as misunderstandings. As Uncle Victor tried to smooth over the situation, I could feel the tension in the room rising. My parents exchanged confused glances, while Grandma Evelyn looked at him with a mix of disbelief and concern. Lucas, who usually stayed out of these kinds of discussions, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he listened closely. Chloe, sensing that something wasn't right, grew quiet, her usual energy replaced with a rare stillness. I pressed on, refusing to let Uncle Victor wriggle out of this one. I pointed out the inconsistencies in his explanations, calmly dissecting his every word in front of the entire family. If these were just ideas, I said, why are there already signatures on the documents? And why are the transfers linked to accounts in your name? The room went silent. Uncle Victor, usually so composed, hesitated. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. I could see the realization dawning on him. There was no easy way out of this. The evidence was too strong, the lies too tangled. He was trapped, just as I had planned. Then, to my surprise, Grandma Evelyn spoke up. "Victor, is this true?" Her voice trembled slightly, but there was an unmistakable firmness in her tone. She was no longer the gentle, trusting grandmother. She was demanding answers, and for the first time, Uncle Victor didn't have them. He stammered, trying to regain control, but the damage was done. "I think we need to see those documents," my father said, quietly but firmly. He reached out for the papers I held, and I handed them over. As my parents and Grandma Evelyn looked them over, I could see their faces harden. The reality of Uncle Victor's betrayal was sinking in, and it hurt. Uncle Victor, seeing that he was cornered, made one last desperate attempt to save face. "It's not what it looks like," he began, his voice strained. "I was only trying to help. I've always had this family's best interests at heart." But no one was buying it anymore, and the entire table grew silent. Eventually, Uncle Victor stood up and left the gathering, and we never saw him at any of the other gatherings till the time Grandma Evelyn fell ill, which was years and years later. But this experience was all I needed to know not to put my business out to family. You know, in every family, there's always that one cog that isn't quite moving in unison with the rest of the machine, you know? And usually not to play stereotypes, but it's the slimy, greasy, creepy uncle. Victor, you suck. I'm glad that your nephew found you out and exposed you in front of everybody. And this is absolutely a happy ending, so hoorah. Nuclear revenge for the win, baby. Gotta love it. With that being said, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed today's video, drop a like and comment below. And if you want to check out our other videos, click the video on the right. With that being said, I'll see you all next time.